Hi there, I'm Claudia Hosky from Fed Insider, and on behalf of the George Washington University Center for Excellence in Public Leadership and ServiceNow, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on how to prioritize during a continuing resolution. Please type your questions and comments into the Q&A pod. If we don't get to them during today's webinar, we'll share them with our speakers so they can follow up with you. Also take note of the Resources tab on the left side of your screen to download today's slides and additional reading on today's topic. We offer live captioning for all of our webinars. To follow along, use the hyperlink under the Live Captioning or CART tab above the slides, and we'll have the full transcript available in the next day or two. And to earn training credit for today's webinar, you'll need to answer all polling questions throughout. And now, let me turn over the reins to our moderator, Jonathan Album, former CIO of USDA and current federal CTO at ServiceNow, to begin today's discussion. Take it away, Jonathan.
Thanks, Claudia. Hi, everybody. As Claudia just shared, prior to joining ServiceNow as a federal CTO, I worked in the federal government for many years as a chief information officer, and I was the CIO of the Department of Agriculture. Throughout my career, I've never started a fiscal year with a finalized budget. It was always a continuing resolution. According to a GAO report from last August, the federal government's had to operate under continuing resolutions in 43 of the past 46 years. So obviously for a lot of feds, it's sort of just this time of year again. And even though the CRs are quote unquote normal, agencies are still required to deal with the effects of operating under a continuing resolution. And while CRs can generally continue funding levels set in the previous year's budget, it hurts an agency's ability to execute on many activities. Programs can't start new projects. Agencies may not be able to hire key employees. Planning for future programs can slow down, and administrative workloads generally increase because as agencies receive money during a CR, that money is prorated based on the duration of the CR. So this continuing resolution adds to the complexity of an already very challenging federal management landscape. And when you add in today's inflationary pressures, its impact, I think, is only exacerbated. So agencies really have to be thoughtful and be very strategic, in my opinion, about how they prioritize their work during this time. And that idea is at the crux of today's webinar. Fortunately, we have three excellent panelists to share their thoughts on this topic. Our panelists today are Elizabeth Field, Director, Defense Capabilities and Management Team at the Government Accountability Office, Dr. Skip Bailey, who is the Deputy CIO at the U.S. Census, and Tim McCrossan, who is the Assistant CIO at USDA Rural Development. And together, we're going to talk about the effects of frozen spending levels on different kinds of activities, such as customer service, hiring, and making contract awards. And we'll describe metrics for setting priorities and maintaining specific activities like customer service and customer experience. And we'll also strategize on what steps agencies can take this year to be prepared for the continuing resolution that's likely to come next year. So we have a lot to talk about, but I want to begin by having our panelists introduce themselves and share a little bit on their background. I'd like to begin with Elizabeth. Welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's good to be here. So for those of you who are not familiar with the GAO, and my guess is many of you are, but for those of you who are not, a GAO is the nonpartisan investigative and oversight arm of Congress. Our mission is to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of federal programs through our work, which is typically program evaluations, performance audits, and investigations. And many of our products, almost all of which are public and can be found on our website, include recommendations to federal agencies. I am, as Jonathan mentioned, in the Defense Capabilities and Management Team at GAO, where I oversee a portfolio that includes assessing how the Department of Defense sort of manages its business operations and reforms itself as a management entity, which of course includes looking at continuing resolutions. This is my second time with GAO. I previously worked at the State Department, and before that with the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. And again, it's great to be here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Skip, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, thanks. It is good to be here. Currently, I'm the Deputy CIO for the Census Bureau, and have spent about the last 22 years in the federal space. Most of it's been in federal law enforcement. Spent a lot of time at the Department of Justice, either as a federal employee or as I worked for Deloitte at one time as supporting the Department of Justice. And I've been the CIO at ATF, and now spend my time with the U.S. Census Bureau. I'm sure if we get talking, you'll maybe learn a few things you didn't know about census. But one thing I'll plug for them is the census's mission is in the Constitution, so it's a great place to work. Your mission is actually defined in the Constitution.
Great point, Skip. I look forward to learning more about you and Census Bureau as we continue. And last but certainly not least, Tim McCrossin. Tim, please give us a little bit of your background.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. Great to be here and with you all. My name is Tim McCrossin. I'm the Assistant CIO for Rural Development, which is one of the big mission areas within USDA. Prior to that, I was an Associate CIO within the OCIO organization, and basically took care of all customer IT issues, and that is everything from network, software, email, authentication, you name it, mobile devices, laptops, we did it all. Before that, I was at DHS, CISA, and really focused on analytical concepts for estimating risk, cyber risk. And prior to that, I was with OMB, and I was the unit chief for agency oversight, and working on, portfolio stat and those types of things. So, and background, I was also at Housing and Urban Development, and spent some time on the Hill supporting the Senate Homeland Security Government Affairs Committee.
Thanks, Tim. You have such a rich background, very varied. I think you're going to have a lot to offer during our conversation today. So again, thanks for being here. Elizabeth, I want to kick things off by asking you a starting question. You talked about the mission of GAO. We know that GAO has done a lot of work looking into the impact of continuing resolutions. You've written several reports on this topic. So can you tell us the kinds of things GAO has found in its research?
Sure. So as you might imagine, it can be hard to isolate the effect of continuing resolutions on the operations of federal agencies. But there are some ways in which we have been able to suss it out and to really see it. And one way that was particularly helpful was for FY 2019, when the Department of Defense did not have a continuing resolution. And so what that did was it allowed us to compare how the department operated during that year with other years when, of course, there were continuing resolutions. And we found, I'm sure not surprisingly, there was a lower rate of obligations when a CR was in effect. We particularly saw that in the first quarter of the fiscal years when there was a CR in effect. There were delays in new starts, particularly related to acquisition. And then, of course, we have also obtained information not just from DoD, but from other agencies, from just speaking with officials who live this life of trying to manage CRs, that there are other anecdotal ways in which they see CRs impact their operations, from hiring that can be slowed, to administrative burdens, to difficulty planning due to funding uncertainty. the one key point I want to make before I turn it back to you is that what we have also found through our research across the federal government and for many years now is that because, unfortunately, continuing resolutions have become essentially the norm, federal agencies have learned to adapt, and I credit the ingenuity and tenacity of public servants who work inside these agencies for coming up with ways to adapt. But there are a number of different mechanisms that agencies can use to address the uncertainty that comes with a continuing resolution, whether it is starting a one-year contract in the second or even third or fourth quarter of a fiscal year to try to anticipate the impacts of an upcoming CR, to postponing non-essential purchases and training, to requesting legislative anomalies. And I'm sure we'll talk about all of those and more strategies in this discussion today.
Well, thanks. I think it's a great way to kick things off. And I think that, you touched on the idea of funding uncertainty. Having lived through a lot of CRs, and I think Skip and Tim, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as we get into it. I've been told by different CFOs that I worked with that you might eventually have the budget to hire that person. You're not prevented from hiring them. But what if, when Congress passes the budget, we don't get as much money as we thought? And, what if, there's a rescission, or what if there's legislation, or what if? And that uncertainty in a large, complex organization like the USDA where I work, or some of the sub-agencies, can essentially grind things to a halt. And it has a real on-the-ground impact. So that funding uncertainty is really a big one. But Skip, I want to jump over to you for a second. And we know that the Census Bureau is obviously very well known for the decennial census. So you said it's in the Constitution. Your mission is perfectly stated, in the Constitution. But people may not know how much work not goes into planning the census, but how much work goes into managing the data and disseminating the data after it's collected. So we're just coming off of the last decennial census, and I think that there's my understanding, a lot of activities at the Census Bureau that are kicking off now, that are continuing now. And I'm just curious how the work and the broader mission might be impacted by a CR.
Yeah, that's a great question. Essentially, the Census Bureau collects, analyzes, and disseminates data about the United States and its people and the economy. Those are the areas that we do. And people are familiar, as you said, with the decennial census, which happens every 10 years. But we do more than 130 surveys and censuses. Some of them on a monthly basis, all the way up to the one that occurs every 10 years that everybody hears about. And as you said, we collect the data, then we analyze it. One of the things that we have to do in the analysis of the data is to make sure that nobody can use that information to get back to individuals that the data was collected from. We have we're all sworn into Title 13, which is a law that governs the use of this data, and so we're restricted from making it available so that people can get back to individuals. So people can only use summary data. And as you can imagine, with the computers the way they are, algorithms, the ability to retro engineer data from summary data to get back to individual data is a possibility. And so we have a disclosure avoidance program that builds into the data. It's kind of a shift in the data that gives accurate summary information without allowing people to go back on the individual. So that's kind of step number one. We have to make sure it's not available. As you know, after 72 years, we do the data, the raw data available. We just released the 1950 census this year, and allowed people to get to that. And once it's then analyzed, and then we analyze it for things like apportionment, which is a big deal, as you can imagine. How people get their counts for Congress and so forth in different populations. But the data is used for just myriads of things, both within the government and outside of the government. And we make that data available once we've protected it. We make it available through a variety of sources. We have a lot of universities and other partners that use data, but through our websites you can get to the data and so on. And a lot of the data has already been posted from the 2020 census. A lot of that summary stuff and is being used to make decisions and go forward. So it's really those three steps of acquiring, protecting, and analyzing, and then disseminating that we're involved in.
So it's a huge mission the agency has, and the work that you described, is sort of ongoing kinds of things, and people are expecting this data to be available at certain times. Are you and your team impacted by the CR in ways, or how are you impacted? And do any of those impacts, bring on risk, create risk for those activities?
Yes, of course. And as you mentioned, because the CR is so reoccurring, shall we say, or happens every year, you do kind of build it in. But there are some very critical timings of data. For example, we handle some of the economic indicators, which have literally only a variability of a few milliseconds of when they can be posted, because you can imagine it affects the economy, and they have to be posted at precisely the right time. And so that's an important consideration. And when you have a continuing resolution, you have to recognize what is most important and what can you not compromise. And something like the release of economic indicators would be one that we've got to make sure we have the funding so that we can, have those released at precisely the right time.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of effort that goes into that. At the Department of Agriculture, there's similar aspects to the mission at the National Agriculture Statistics Service or Economic Research Service, and similarly, they release statistics at exactly the right time. That millisecond or two makes a difference, and those systems have to work and need to be invested in. And that's something that you have to prioritize. So that's, I think, one of the sort of key takeaways, thinking about what's most important and making sure that's on the list and will operate. So thanks, Jeff. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't want to take everybody's time, but it reminds me, a few years ago, there was, I won't name the state, but there was a state having financial trouble. So one of the things they did was cut back on funding for prisons and had them release a certain number of prisoners. So in their passive-aggressive behavior, the prisons department started with felons. It's kind of like, do you release jaywalkers or felons first? Well, we're going to start with felons. And so simply asking people what's important, whatever they're doing is the most important. And so you really have to dig and understand the mission in order to, because everybody feels like what they're doing is the most important thing. But there are a lot of things, if they wait, airplanes will not fall out of the sky. We will be able to continue and be able to pick it up later. And it's knowing the mission is really critical in doing that.
Yeah, I'm writing that down. Know the mission and prioritize. Good. So speaking about a mission that I know, having worked at USDA, I want to turn over to Tim for a second, rural development. Tim, we both know the role RD plays around the country, and it's really a key player in the recently passed infrastructure bill. So thinking about infrastructure, thinking about rural America and the support RD provides to rural Americans, how are you and your team in the agency impacted by the CR?
Well, so it's a sort of you ask a question that kind of cuts both ways, right? So just as Skip said, knowing your priorities is the most important thing. And, Skip clearly understands the priorities at Census. Priorities at RD, Rural Development, we have the, broadband infrastructure program, and, the Reconnect program, and getting broadband internet capabilities out to rural America is number one. And so, the question then is, the resources for that are essentially set. Then the question is, will we have the IT capabilities to deliver on the program, right? This is a program. It's somewhat labor intensive in terms of the application and the review of applications, and then eventually getting to the award of loans and grants to support this program. And so, there's a lot of IT that goes into that, and especially with the changes, and this is the key, and I'm really interested to hear from Elizabeth on this issue, because there's a number of technical issues in terms of interpretation, because whenever you talk about IT, and I'll say small d development, right? So, it's basically maintenance changes on capabilities that are already in existence. And so we have the Reconnect application system. And, if we want to, launch another funding opportunity announcement, for me, I would say we've already done that 4 times. That does not reflect a new type of capability. We're not developing something new. We're simply extending the existing capabilities to have a new round of funding. But, on this particular issue, intelligent people can disagree. And that essentially gets us to the core of the problem, because under a continuing resolution, you can't start new IT systems unless you get permission from Congress that's acceptable, and there's a process for that. And so that then becomes the dilemma, and we have to consider whether these capabilities that we're intending to create constitute new development, which would be big D development, or if they're essentially maintenance releases or extensions of current capabilities. And that's really the heart of the problem.
Yeah, that's well stated, Tim. Everyone knows you can't start a new project during a CR, or no new starts. But what is a new start? And I've seen it cut both ways. It's sort of in the eye of the beholder. I worked with another agency last year that had some cybersecurity challenges at the beginning of the last fiscal year, and they were about to start a new project, and they thought they had the green light until someone in the agency decided that was a new project. They were replacing an existing capability, and that to replace the existing capability was considered to be a new project, whereas they wanted to say, we have this capability, we're upgrading it, to your point. And at another agency, a different decision could have been made. So Elizabeth, I don't know if this is something GAO's examined in the research you were describing, but I'd love for you to provide some perspective based on what you've learned about it, and if there's a place that people can go to become better educated on maybe a technical definition.
Sure. Well, so absolutely, this question of what constitutes a new start and the prohibition on new starts has come up in a lot of our work, because it is one of the many aggravations that agencies experience with CRs. A resource that I would point the listeners to here is a report that we issued just recently about continuing resolutions. It was focused on 3 agencies, USDA, Department of Education, and HHS, but there's a fantastic figure in the report. The report number is GAO-22-104701, And it's figure 2 on page 10, and it talks about the standard provisions included in continuing resolutions and what they mean. And there is a really helpful definition and discussion there of the no new starts provision. What I will tell you based on our work is a few things. One is it all kind of comes down to your general counsel, right? And so understanding where the attorneys in your agency come down on these questions and having good partnership and communication with them is clearly important. The other two really key players here are, of course, OMB and Congress. And we have seen some examples of some creative ways to get around this issue of the no new starts prohibition in CRs. And one example of that would be that back in 2018, the Navy raised a concern that its ship-to-shore connector program, it didn't have any production planned for fiscal year 2020. It had been doing it in 2018 and was planning for FY 2019. And so the concern became that if fiscal year 21 began under a CR, which of course it ultimately did, then any planned production for that year would be considered a new start, and then there would be disruption in this really important program. What ultimately ended up happening is that Navy officials were able to work with Congress to get just one single ship-to-shore connector authorized for fiscal year 20, so that if there were a CR in fiscal year 21, it wouldn't be considered a new start. So being able to work through solutions with partners in OMB and with partners on the Hill seems to be really critical for agencies. That said, it is, of course, time-consuming and certainly not efficient.
So what I take from that example, and it sounds that's really sort of a creative way to think about it, is, get the project started in 2020 in your example, or, we're in 2023 now, so get the project started in 2023, even if it's in a small way. So, and define the project. So it's very clear that for Tim's example, the project may include up to 20 funding opportunities or some number. So you've set some parameters in the scope that makes it clear you've begun the work. That's what I'm taking from your example. That requires a lot of communication and agencies' willingness to put something out there for comment to either Congress or OMB or someone.
Jonathan, if I may, though,
go ahead.
There's a little bit of a catch-22 here, right? So, and
Mm-hmm.
the point is that Congress gave rural development these funds to use in support of the program, and so it's Congress's expectation that the funds will be exhausted in support of the parameters that were laid out, and there's an aspect where you can make the case that the IT capabilities are necessary to deliver on what was the will of Congress, right? And so, there's a part on this where, I can't agree with Elizabeth more on the communication, right? The communication between, especially the staffers in the Hill who are focused on the particular programs, and then the OMB, the Resource Management Office, budget examiners who are also focused on that. There's got to be unity of vision and approach on this particular point, but the argument that I would make is, how do we deliver on Congress's decision that these funds, these resources, should be used to make loans and grants to nonprofit organizations without the IT? Isn't it inherent that the IT capabilities must mature in order to deliver on that?
Mm-hmm. So it's how you tell your story. Go ahead, Skip.
I think you also raised the kind of the parallel issue, which is there's also a lot of uncertainty about how long a continuing resolution will last. And so, we have the initial one until December, but then, some years it's March or April before you finally get out of it. And then as you mentioned, Tim, you're supposed to spend all that money And so it's being withheld until the contingent. So in the back half of the year, you've got to accelerate the way in which you can spend that money, and you want to do that wisely. And sometimes that's difficult, especially for IT systems. Sometimes really hard to accelerate development. Putting, years and years ago, there was a book written called Mythical Man Month, but sometimes just putting more and more people on it doesn't really result in an increase in the delivery of something. And so that's the corollary problem that exists that sometimes you don't see, because even when you get the green light, can you effectively spend all that money and get the results that you had planned for that year?
Yeah, I love that point, Skip, because you're also I don't know how many procurements you have in your office, but your typical IT office spends a lot of money before the end of the fiscal year, and you're inundating your contracting office with procurement requests and RFPs and the like, and the CR doesn't get resolved until April, March, April timeframe. You're trying to do all that in 6 months, and you have you got a real time compression problem. So it's hard to do good spending, good procurements for all of them in a short period of time. You need the full year, if not longer. So if you haven't done good planning, you're at risk of maybe buying something that you don't need, or buying too much of something, or running out of time to buy something that's really essential. So how do we prioritize? Back to your point, I'll open this up. And Tim, maybe you can start on this because you've done a lot of project program management work. How do you prioritize to make sure that the most important procurements, the most important things are going to get done in that compressed timeline that we had last year? Last year the CR wasn't resolved until March 9th or 10th, I think. This year it could be similar or later. Again, by the time you get your money, you have your approval to move forward on things, you're looking at 6 months or less. So what do you do to make sure you're taking the risk out?
Different people approach this problem differently. There are certain fixed costs that we know that we have to cover. Staff. There are certain maintenance contracts for, as Skip said, those high impact capabilities. Those must be covered. We don't have an opportunity to shortchange those types of things. But then, as you also said, there are certain acquisitions which can be delayed or deferred. And I think Elizabeth's research points this out as well. When it comes to, we all loathe the fact that we buy laptops late in the year, but it's absolutely one of those acquisitions which can always slide to the right on the calendar. I despise the fact that we do that. I would much rather acquire my laptops and receive them and get them deployed not at the same time as everybody else in the federal government, because that gives Dells and HPs a better opportunity to fulfill my order in a timely manner. But the way that we are structuring our appropriations just doesn't really help us to get there. But Skip also does bring up a really, really important point that I think we really need to pay attention to. The timing of the continuing resolution and the certainty of whether or not, for example, we know that we're going to go until December under our current CR. But then the question we have is, well, come December, are we looking at a full year CR? Are we looking at the potential that there could be a budget? We don't have clarity in terms of after December. And, I think that we could all live with a full year CR if that gave us the clarity about where we would be at the end of the year. It's the degree to which we go and progress through a fiscal year and lack that clarity that is really the thing that I think impacts us from a planning perspective. When we started the year, the previous fiscal year, actually 2 years before, we developed our plan for what we would be acquiring and when we would, be spending that money. And then we go into a fiscal, a continuing resolution, and then essentially we take that plan and kind of throw it out the window because, we have to then be reacting instead of being proactive to work the plan.
So great point. You can't even work the plan if you had something that you wanted to start now and you had the funds to do it. You might not even be able to do it because you don't get all of the funds that you should have for the duration of the CR. They may come to the agency, but they don't come into your accounts. I had a meeting with a budget officer this morning from another agency, and I mentioned I was going to be on this webinar, and he bemoaned they only got 75% of their allotment for the first from October 1st to December 16th, and that creates a lot of administrative burden because you're funding contracts for partial periods of time, and it's just a lot of administrative effort. And I suspect things like that are occurring across agencies. And Elizabeth, I want to pivot back to you for a second. And when you were describing the impacts, you mentioned additional administration, increased administrative burden. And I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. Is it this issue I'm describing, or someone described to me, of a partial allotment and the work related to that, or broader kinds of administrative challenges?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it can take a lot of different forms, including the ones that you mentioned. One example that I'd like to highlight, because I think it's so it's just so clear how it impacts people in a real way, is Health and Human Services LIHEAP program, the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, and this speaks directly to the question, Tim, that you were raising about how funding uncertainty can really be a problem. And so, what HHS officials told my colleagues in GAO Strategic Issues Group that did this work is that when grantees don't receive their funds in the spring or summer, when they receive their funds in the spring or summer, but they are grantees that are only offering heating and heating-related assistance, they then have to take extra steps that they wouldn't normally have to take to spend the funds. And that can mean hiring new staff to resume outreach to households who needed the support back when it wasn't able to be provided, to review household applications. And it goes the other way as well, when sometimes funding becomes available in the winter, and there are grantees under the LIHEAP program that only offer summer cooling assistance. And so I find that just to be a really compelling example of how these uncertainties can have real life impacts. The other two things I want to note, just to piggyback off of Tim's really helpful comments, are one, it's absolutely kind of the luck of the draw when it comes to how resilient your program is going to be to a CR because of the color of money that you have, or whether you have 5 years to spend it, like in the case of DoD military construction spending, or you have 1 year, right, in the case of O&M funding, which can make it much harder. And so that's another complicating factor. And the last thing I'll say is we have seen DoD, and I believe other agencies, now coming up with multiple scenario plans. So looking at a 30-day CR, a 60-day, a 90-day. I wouldn't be surprised if they're now doing 180 days and so on and so forth. But that's one strategy we've seen agencies take. Of course, again, that's another administrative burden to take the time to develop 3 different scenarios for spending your funds.
Yep. Well, those are excellent points. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think Tim talks about it, and Elizabeth sort of intimated it, but one of the principles, if we're saying what are some takeaway principles, one of them is to have something that you can put money on at the end of the year that you can reliably do that. And he mentioned laptops. We have a services contract that we can always forward fund. And so sometimes if you can't, you're not able to do it, you can at least use that money and then, switch the budget next year to fund the things you wanted to, and you take it from the contract. So just that preset strategy that says, if I have money at the end of the year, here's where I can put it.
Right. So creating some flexibility with contracting vehicles that are available and easy to use. That's another great suggestion. I want to pivot to some current topics that agencies are dealing with and see how these are impacting, if so. And we also do have some questions coming in from the audience. So let's just think about where we are as a government and community today, coming off the pandemic. We know that expectations for customer service and customer experience are different. People have different expectations about how providers, offer services. And a lot of agencies are in transition to doing things either online or in a quote-unquote touchless manner. I'm curious, Skip, the Census Bureau, you interact with a lot of people, a lot of the public. Are there new expectations for how, the public interacts with the Census Bureau, and can you meet those expectations? Do you need to start new projects that are going to be further delayed because you can't start them during this year?
Yeah, I think this gets down to understanding what those expectations are and how entrenched they are. People can be very forgiving under some circumstances, and yet be very rigid and demanding under other circumstances. And so I think it's getting to know, I hope this isn't taken the wrong way, but what can you get away with? What can we delay that we won't deliver as we said we would, versus what really has to hit the time. And for us, the priority always comes down to the security of the data. If we have a security incident, and people lose, we lose credibility in the eyes of the public, we're dead in the water, because we're totally dependent on the trust of the American public in order for us to do our mission. And so we recognize that some things are sort of unforgiven, and one of those would be having a security incident. So that helps us put things like that at the very top. If we had some data sets that we said would be available in April and we didn't get them till June, with an explanation, we could probably keep people from getting too upset. And so, if you have to trade those two off, you protect the data first. And then, we can live, if we deliver a little late on this thing, then we can live with that, and the public will let us live with it.
Right. So back to priorities: protect the data, protect people's privacy. Do the sort of baseline foundational things that inspire, that maintain whatever trust we have in government at this moment, and then ideally build on those things through maybe new projects or activities that further create trust. Is kind of what I'm taking. And I think that's a really good strategy. And talking about trust and building trust, it's people, you gain trust in drops, but you lose it in buckets. I've heard that said before. And I think what you can take that from your comments, Skip. And one way to build trust is to with the public is do good projects. And we have a question that sort of ties into this about how a CR might impact a local government. And I'm going to expand it to say local communities. And Tim, I want to turn to you for a second, because rural development does a lot of projects in communities all over the country, primarily in rural America. But these projects have a real impact on the way communities operate. And you mentioned maybe some challenges getting some funding opportunities out there for infrastructure. For infrastructure built for broadband. What other kinds of things does RD do, and how do you, how do you work with those program offices during this time of the CR and make sure they have those agencies, those program officials have what they need so the agency can do its mission?
I mean, this is a very ripe topic for us because, as you know, Jonathan, it was last December, the president signed the executive order on customer experience, and RD is one of the key organizations that is endeavoring to deliver and what the president's vision was. One of the core business areas for rural development is, we actually hold mortgages with lots of people in rural America, direct mortgages. And so when the president published his executive order on customer experience, I feel like, I know that a lot of my colleagues here in RD feel the same, is, we're one of the agencies that he was targeting most, because right now, if you are a mortgagee in rural development, you want to know what your last payment date was, or you want to figure out what your payoff amount is for the mortgage that we hold, quite frankly, you have to call the 800 number. There is no, customer portal that you can go to just to see your account, your transactions with USDA concerning your mortgage. And so, this is, 2022, about to be 2023, and we are an organization that feels very much like we need to catch up with what commercial industry banking is delivering for their customers. And so when we think about, the impacts, the effects of a continuing resolution, this is one of the key things for me, is because, this enhancing this customer experience is definitely, unequivocally a new start. And I feel very strongly that Congress will support us in this, and that OMB would be inclined to support an anomaly in this. But the truth of the matter is, with all of this uncertainty around the budget, I think we go somewhat slower in this because we're hopeful that there will be more certainty around the budget resources that will be available for the balance of the fiscal year before we start to make commitments in addressing this core issue.
Yeah, I mean, helping RD catch up to where commercial banking is, that's a tremendous, it's a big lift. And again, having been at USDA, I know this is not the first time someone said we're going to tackle this. And I think, Tim, you have a great opportunity to be successful here, but not if you don't have the ability to get started. And I think that is, maybe such Elizabeth shared some, good past examples. This is a great current example of work you want to do, and you can't get your hands around it just yet. So, it's as frustrating as that is. I'm wondering if, there are things we can do to either educate the workforce or get out there and talk about these things, get ready to do some procurements or market research or what have you, so you're ready to go on all cylinders when you have a budget. Are you thinking about, baby steps?
I don't know whether Elizabeth thought that the report that she cited earlier, which I'll say it again, just because it's such a significant report, and it helps me in making my case with my colleagues in the finance office, in the CFO organization, as well as the acquisition office. And so that report was GAO 22-104701. And it's an outstanding report because it helps to lend clarity in this very, very complex and confusing area. And so there are ways that you can do new starts, but you have to follow the process. We're the federal government so of course there's a process for it. But you can do it. You just have to be aware of the process and then execute that process consistently with throughout the overall organization.
Yeah. No, very good. And, I'm hopeful that we can make those reports that Elizabeth mentioned available to everyone on this call. So to the folks at Fed Insider, if we could share those out as resources after this, I think that would be great, because to Tim's point, there's a lot in there that can help you in a conversation with the CFO, with the general counsel, with others as you're strategizing. And again, we don't know how long we're going to be in this period this year, but we know it's going to be until at least December 16th and possibly longer. And we also can guess pretty accurately that we're going to be in this next year and maybe the year after that and the year after that. So these are strategies that don't just help you right now, they help you long term. And a lot of these projects and programs that we're talking about, these are long-term endeavors. So we're going to be dealing with this over time. Elizabeth, as we sort of come into our wrap up, I want to come back to you and maybe get ask one more question about the reports that you shared and about the this idea of educating our workforce on these topics, like Tim was describing. Did you find anything in the research? Did you find anything in the research about benefits for educating the workforce, or how to educate the workforce, or topics maybe the workforce needs to be up to speed on relative to operating during a CR? And if not, any ideas on things that we should be sharing, or suggestions of things we should be sharing with our teams?
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much for the kind words about the GAO reports that we're talking about today. I know a lot of people put a lot of work into them, and I would just list out one other report number here, which is GAO-21-541, which is the report we did specific to the defense budget and the effects of CRs on DoD. I think what we have seen when it comes to the workforce are two things. One is because CRs are so routine now, we see this sort of institutional knowledge and understanding of how to prepare for CRs in many pockets of these agencies, and they tend to pass that knowledge on to new folks as they come into the workforce. And so we haven't necessarily seen as a strategy any standalone, maybe educational programs for the workforce, just because it's such a constant that the institutions have built up that knowledge through the really hardworking public servants who are trying to manage CRs every year. But one thing that does relate to the workforce that I'd like to highlight that we maybe haven't talked about a lot is the impact of CRs on hiring. And we do see, for example, in the Department of Defense, a relative slowdown in hiring of civilian personnel in the first quarter of fiscal years when there's a CR in place. And that can have, a real detrimental effect to the agency's ability to operate and to recruit and retain high quality personnel, which is an issue that I think all federal agencies face. And so that's something that I think about when I think about workforce and the impact of CRs.
Yeah, very good. Were you able to discern what caused the hiring slowdown exactly? Was it consistent, or is it just, a case by case?
Well, so in part it was just because of the type of funding that went into civilian personnel hiring, and they just literally couldn't. But there were also other factors that impacted civilian hiring that didn't have anything to do with the CR. For example, most service members and their families will move locations in the summer, and so you see a change in the slowdown in hiring during that time, and then a ramp up. But certainly, there are effects on civilian hiring that CR.
There's no prohibition on hiring. It's just perhaps more complicated, or there's less certainty around funding So someone might say, slow down. It's been my experience on this.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned before, we did have that one fiscal year when there wasn't a CR, and we were able to compare the average hiring and it was just much higher.
Yeah. So again, I think that's an important observation, not just for in the DoD, but you'd expect that you'd have similar impacts in civilian agencies. And we know we don't have enough cyber workers. We know that we struggle to recruit IT talent and others. So there's unfilled critical positions in agencies that are unfilled for longer, and again impact to the way agencies meet their missions. That we have to be mindful of as people in and around the federal government about what the expectations people have to get the work done and what resources Congress is giving us, the ability to get that work done. It doesn't always align as nicely as you'd hope. But I think the benefit of a discussion like this is we're talking about some things that don't always get talked about. And part of thinking of strategies is to express the frustrations and ideally the opportunities. And I think that you've all done that very, very well during today's conversation. And I'm hoping that you can all share a few final thoughts or a lesson learned, or maybe a hope for the rest of the fiscal year as we continue down this first CR through December 16th. And Skip, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I think we've come up with a number of points just in summary that we can do. Number one, know your priorities, know your mission, make sure that the things that something might be important, but it can be delayed, that, can be delayed. We also talked about preparing in advance, and by preparing in advance, you may kick off projects before the end of the fiscal year in order to be able to carry them forward. Then also knowing where to put things at the end of the year so that you can capture, the money and use it as best you can. So I think all of those are kind of little tools that you can use to prioritize and make sure that you get the best benefit for the time and the money that you're going to spend during that year.
Great point, Skip. Tim, what would you like to add?
The thing, first of all, thank you everybody for participating in this. This is probably the wonkiest of wonky conversations that the federal government can have. But the thing that I would like to, parting gift would be consideration that when we like to think that, oh, well, you can just buy a portion or piecemeal, right? So we'll give you, 25% of the resources for the fiscal year, and you'll go buying 25% of the IT stuff that you would have bought anyway. The problem with that is that the administrative burden for buying 50 laptops is exactly the same as it is for buying 5,000 laptops. And so really what we're talking about from a resource perspective is double the workload. We're doubling the workload each time we do this. And so, if we get years where we get multiple CRs, I hope this is not one of them, but, right now we're looking at, a multiplier of 2 on, one continuing resolution, and then hopefully we get a budget or a full year CR. But if they kick the can down the road again, then and there's another short-term CR, then that's a multiplier of 3. And every time we do that, we are essentially multiplying that workload by however many CRs temporary CRs we have in a given year. And that is there is an impact on that. And I think that we have to be cognizant of that. I think we should estimate it. Yeah.
That's great. Understanding that administrative burden and being able to quantify it, share that up with our friends in Congress and elsewhere. I think that's just great education for people. And Elizabeth, I'm gonna let you conclude. You shared such great information from those reports, and I know we're going to be able to make those available. Any final thoughts on those findings or ideas moving forward for our listeners?
Sure, and let me echo Tim's thanks for the session today. I certainly learned a lot from you all and enjoyed participating. I think two key takeaways. One, unfortunately, CRs are not going away, and so taking advantage of all the resources we've talked about today is important. But second, to bring it back to something, Jonathan, that you mentioned at the outset, I am really interested in and concerned about the effect of inflation in the economy today and what that means for agencies that have really important missions to be able to operate under CRs. And so that's something that we're going to be looking at GAO, and I know a lot of others are looking at as well. So thank you again.
Well, that's a great point. We didn't get to talk about that very much, but I think we'll all be looking for that as we thinking about that as we move into the rest of the fiscal year. I just want to conclude by thanking you all. I picked up on the points around communication with your Hill staffers, with OMB, making sure creating as much clarity as we can around what we are trying to accomplish and what funding we need. I thought were great points. But this isn't going away. We're going to have to keep talking about this, and I think we've started a great conversation today. I look forward to continuing. Elizabeth, Skip, and Tim, thank you for all the work that you do, and you all contributed to a wonderful discussion. Thank you to the audience for listening and for the questions that came in, and I also want to thank the team at Fed Insider and ServiceNow who made this possible. I'm going to turn things back over to Fed's Insider for some final thoughts and to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks again to our speakers today. And for our audience, thank you for your participation. Training certificates will be emailed after the webinar ends. And remember to log back in the next day or two to download a copy of today's captioning transcript. We have many webinars in the works, so be sure to visit fedinsider.com to see what's coming up and to register for multiple events at the same time. And while you're there, you can check out our podcast, Feds at the Edge. And with that, this is Fed Insider, signing off.